My name is Diane Whitfield, and for 22 years, I thought I knew exactly what my life was going to look like on the day I turned 52. I did not think it would end with me standing in a hotel hallway in Denver, Colorado, holding a bottle of champagne I would never open, staring at a face that looked exactly like my husband's, but wasn't his. I'll get to that. I have to get to that slowly, because if I tell it to you the way it happened in my head, all at once, all in a single unbearable second, you won't believe me. I didn't believe it myself, and I was the one standing there. So let me start where it actually started. 3 weeks earlier, in my kitchen in Charlotte, North Carolina, with a calendar in one hand and a plane ticket confirmation glowing on my laptop screen. My husband's name is Richard. Richard Whitfield, 54 years old, a regional operations consultant for a mid-sized logistics firm. For the last 9 years, that job had taken him to Denver for what he called the quarterly close. 4 to 6 days, 3 or 4 times a year, sometimes more if a client account was struggling. I never questioned it. Why would I? Richard was not a mysterious man. He paid the mortgage on time. He remembered my mother's birthday before I did. He fell asleep on the couch during every single movie we ever watched together, and he apologized for it every single time, like it was a new and shocking development. We met when I was 28 and he was 30. I was working as a junior accountant at a firm downtown, drowning in spreadsheets, and he came in to consult on an audit. He brought me coffee on the second day without asking how I took it, and somehow got it exactly right. Cream, no sugar. I still don't know how he knew that. When I asked him, years later, he just smiled and said, "I paid attention." That was Richard in one sentence. A man who paid attention. Or so I believed for 2 decades. We built an ordinary life, and I want to be clear that I do not say that with any bitterness. Ordinary was the whole point. We raised 2 children, our son Marcus, now 24 and living in Atlanta, and our daughter Renee, 21 and finishing her degree in Charlotte. We buried Richard's mother together in 2016. We fought about money in our 30s and stopped fighting about it in our 40s because we'd finally figured out how to talk instead of accuse. I built my own small accounting practice from nothing, working out of a spare bedroom for the first 4 years before I could afford an office. Richard used to tell people, at dinner parties, that I was the most disciplined person he'd ever met. I liked being known that way. I liked being known, period. Our 22nd anniversary was coming up on a Thursday. Richard had already told me, almost apologetically, that he'd be in Denver that week for the close. "I hate that it's landing on the day," he said, over dinner, 2 weeks before. "I'll make it up to you. We'll do something big for 25. I remember nodding and telling him it was fine. And it was fine, mostly. 22 years teaches you that anniversaries are dates, not proof of anything. But that night, after he went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a glass of wine, and an idea took hold of me that I could not shake. What if I went to him instead? I don't know exactly why that particular idea, on that particular night, felt so urgent. Maybe it was that Marcus had just texted a photo of himself at his new apartment, looking so grown and so far away, and it had made me feel the specific ache of time passing faster than I wanted it to. Maybe it was that I'd turned 52 that spring and had started noticing, in a way I hadn't before, how many of my friends were burying husbands, not surprising them. Maybe I just wanted, for one night, to be the kind of wife who did something reckless and romantic instead of sensible. I booked a flight to Denver for the Wednesday before our anniversary. 6 hours with a layover in Dallas. I told no one except my sister, Patricia, who has never in her life been able to keep a secret from me, but who I trusted completely to keep this one, because she loved Richard almost as much as I did. "You're going to surprise him at the hotel?" she said, on the phone, half laughing. "Diane, you hate surprises. You hate being surprised and you hate doing surprises. Who are you right now?" "I want to see his face," I told her. 22 years, Pat. I want, just once, to be standing in a doorway he isn't expecting. I didn't tell Richard I had the week free. My biggest client, a chain of dental offices I handled quarterly filings for, had pushed their meeting, and I'd cleared my calendar without mentioning it to him. It felt delicious, honestly, keeping that secret. It felt like being 28 again, sneaking around the edges of something good. I packed light. A single carry-on, a black dress I hadn't worn in 3 years, the kind of lipstick I only put on for special occasions. I bought a small bottle of champagne at the airport, the good kind, wrapped in tissue paper by the woman at the shop who told me, unprompted, that I looked like a woman going somewhere important. I told her. I'm going to surprise my husband. She smiled at that in a way I would later replay in my mind more times than I can count. It wasn't a knowing smile. It wasn't suspicious. It was just warm. The way strangers are warm to you when they think your life is simple and good. I had no idea, sitting in that gift shop with my champagne and my new lipstick, that I was about to learn my husband had been living a life I knew nothing about for 9 years. I had no idea that the word quarterly close had been doing more work in our marriage than I could possibly imagine. I only knew that I loved him and that I wanted, for one night, to surprise him. The flight to Denver had a 2-hour layover in Dallas, and I spent most of it doing what I always do when I'm nervous. I made lists. Not because I needed to, but because organizing small things has always made the large, unmanageable things feel survivable. I made a list of restaurants near his hotel. I made a list of things I wanted to say to him when he opened the door. I made a list, even, of what I'd tell our kids about this trip, imagining already how Renee would tease me for being so extra and how Marcus would probably just say, "That's really sweet, Mom," in the gentle, slightly distracted way he says most things to me now. Somewhere over Texas, my phone buzzed. A text from Richard. "Running behind on the close. Might be a late one tonight. Miss you. Happy almost anniversary." I stared at that message longer than it deserved. Miss you. He didn't know I was 35,000 feet closer to him than he thought. I typed back, "Miss you too," thinking of the moment, hours from now, when I would knock on his door and he would understand exactly how much. I want to tell you honestly that there was a small, strange feeling underneath my excitement that whole flight, one I didn't examine closely enough at the time. It wasn't suspicion, not exactly. It was something quieter, a kind of static. It had started about 4 months earlier, when I'd noticed Richard had started taking his phone into the bathroom when he showered, propped on the counter, face down. I'd asked him about it once, lightly, not really thinking anything of it, and he'd said he was listening to a podcast about supply chain logistics, which was such a boring, believable answer that I hadn't thought about it again until just now, on this plane, watching the clouds. It had started, too, around the time his Denver trips had gone from 3 times a year to almost 5. He'd explained it as the client account struggling. And I remembered nodding along, because I trusted him the way you trust gravity. Not because you've tested it that day, but because it has simply always held. I want to be honest about something else, too. 22 years in, our marriage was good, but it was not electric. We had settled into the specific rhythm that long marriages settle into, where love becomes less a feeling and more a structure. The coffee made just right every morning. The way he always took the aisle seat on flights because he knew I liked the window. The fact that he still, after all these years, reached for my hand during turbulence without either of us saying anything about it. I had told myself, many times, that this was what real love matured into. Quiet. Dependable. Undramatic. I landed in Denver at 6:40 in the evening, Mountain Time. My heart was going so fast I could feel it in my ears. I took a rideshare straight from the airport to the Blackwood Grand, the hotel Richard always stayed at for the close. A tall glass building downtown with a lobby full of low leather furniture and a bar that smelled like cedar and expensive whiskey. I checked my reflection in the rideshare's window before I got out. 52 years old, and I still felt, in that moment, like the 28-year-old who'd once waited nervously for a man to bring her coffee. The concierge at the front desk was kind enough to confirm, without giving away too much, that Mr. Whitfield was indeed checked in. Room 914. After I explained, with my most disarming smile, that I was his wife and this was a surprise for our anniversary, she actually pressed her hand to her chest a little when I told her. "That's so sweet," she said. "You picked a good week for it. It's been quiet up there." Quiet. I would think about that word many times in the days that followed. I took the elevator to the 9th floor with my champagne in one hand and my heart absolutely hammering. I remember the elevator music, something instrumental and forgettable. And I remember practicing my smile in the polished steel doors, checking my lipstick one more time. I found room 914 at the end of a long, carpeted hallway, the kind of soft, patterned carpet that swallows the sound of footsteps. I stood outside that door for almost a full minute before I knocked, just breathing, just letting myself feel the whole shape of 22 years. The wedding in my parents' backyard, the 2 kids, the small apartment before the first house, the bigger house after, every ordinary Tuesday that had somehow, without my noticing, added up to a life. I knocked 3 times. I heard footsteps on the other side, slow ones. And then the door opened. I want to walk you through this moment exactly as it happened, because for the rest of my life, I will remember every single detail of it. The temperature of the hallway, the faint smell of the hotel's lavender-scented cleaning product, the specific weight of the champagne bottle in my hand. The door opened, and for one full second, my brain told me it was Richard. It was the eyes first. The same deep-set brown eyes, the same slight downward tilt at the outer corner that Richard has. Then the jaw. Square, a little stubborn-looking, exactly like Richard's. Then the way this person stood, weight shifted slightly onto one hip, one hand still on the doorknob, the exact posture Richard takes when he's not sure who's on the other side of a door. But it wasn't Richard. It was a boy, a teenager, maybe 15 or 16. Tall the way boys that age get suddenly tall, wearing a gray hoodie and socks with no shoes, holding a video game controller in one hand like he'd paused mid-match to answer the door. He looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us said anything for what felt like an impossibly long time, though it could only have been 2 or 3 seconds. He said finally. Can I help you? I don't remember what I said. I know I said something, because he responded to it, but the actual words are gone from my memory, wiped clean by the sheer static of what my eyes were showing me and what my brain was refusing to process. What I remember is the room behind him. A queen bed with the comforter pushed into a messy pile. A second, smaller bed against the far wall with a backpack on it, the kind kids sling over one shoulder for school. A laptop open on the desk, playing something with music. Sneakers. 2 pairs, one clearly a child's size, one an adult woman's. Lined up by the door the way people line up shoes when they're trying to keep a hotel room tidy for a longer than usual stay. I started, and then stopped, because I genuinely did not know how to finish that sentence. Is Richard here? Is this the right room? Is this my husband's son? Mom! The boy called back over his shoulder, not taking his eyes off me. There's a lady at the door. A woman's voice answered from somewhere inside, muffled, easy, unbothered. Who is it, baby? Baby. I stood in that hallway holding a bottle of champagne wrapped in tissue paper, wearing a black dress I hadn't worn in 3 years, and I felt something happen in my chest that I can only describe as a kind of controlled collapse. Not fainting, not crying, just every single assumption I had about my life quietly, silently giving way beneath me, like a floor with the support beams removed one at a time. A woman appeared behind the boy. Younger than me, maybe by 10 or 12 years, with dark hair pulled into a loose bun and reading glasses pushed up on her head. She was wearing one of Richard's shirts. I know it was Richard's shirt because I recognized the small coffee stain near the second button, a stain I had tried and failed to get out of that exact blue button-down 8 months ago. She looked at me the way you look at someone you don't recognize but sense, immediately, that you should. Can I help you? She asked, echoing her son almost exactly. I heard myself say, in a voice that did not sound like mine, I'm looking for Richard Whitfield. Her face changed. Not dramatically. Just a small, quick shift, the kind of shift you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. And I was watching for it, because some part of me, some cold, clinical, accountant's part of my brain that had apparently been quietly tracking discrepancies for months without telling the rest of me, was already assembling a picture. He's not here right now, she said carefully. Can I ask who's asking? And that was the moment I understood, standing in that hallway with my champagne going warm in my hand, that I was not going to get an honest answer from this woman by asking directly. Whatever this was, she was protecting it. And whoever she was protecting it for, she clearly believed she had every right to be standing in that room, in my husband's shirt, with a teenage boy who had my husband's exact face calling her mom. "I'm a colleague of his," I said. The lie came out of me smoothly, in a voice I didn't know I had. "From out of town. Wrong room, I think. I'm sorry to bother you." I turned and walked back toward the elevator, and I did not run, though every cell in my body wanted to. I pressed the button and waited, feeling the boy and the woman's eyes on my back the entire time. And when the doors finally opened and I stepped inside and they closed behind me, I put my hand over my mouth and I did not make a sound, because I did not trust what would come out of me if I did. I stood in that elevator, going down 9 floors, holding a bottle of anniversary champagne, and I thought, I have to see his face. Whatever this is, I need to see Richard's face when he understands that I know. But I didn't know yet. Not really. I had a 15-year-old boy's face and a stranger's coffee-stained shirt in a room with 2 beds. I did not have proof, and 22 years of marriage to a man I respected. Even now, even in this, had taught me that the worst thing I could do was accuse before I understood. I didn't leave the hotel. I want you to understand that, because everything that came after depended on this one decision. I sat down in the lobby, in a low leather chair near the window, with my carry-on at my feet and my champagne still in its tissue paper on my lap like some kind of grotesque prop from a play I no longer wanted a part in, and I waited. I texted Patricia one line, "Something is very wrong. Call you later. Don't call me now." Then I put my phone face down on my knee and I made myself breathe. Richard walked into that lobby at 8:52 that night. I know the time because I looked at my watch the second I saw him come through the revolving door, briefcase in hand, tie loosened, looking exactly like a man who had spent 9 hours in a client meeting, which, I would later learn, was at least partly true. He did work that day. He did have a real meeting. That was the strange, sick genius of what I was about to discover. Richard hadn't built a fantasy. He'd built a second, entirely functional life and slotted it in beside the real one so precisely that neither one had ever had to know about the other. He saw me before I said anything. I watched his face do something I had never seen it do in 22 years. A full-body flinch, like his whole system had short-circuited at once. The briefcase actually dropped from his hand for a second before he caught it against his leg. "Diane!" My name came out of him like something being pulled out sideways. "What? What are you doing here?" "I flew out to surprise you," I said, and I heard how flat and strange my own voice sounded, all the romance drained out of it. "For our anniversary." I watched him look toward the elevators, a fast, involuntary flick of his eyes, and in that single glance, I understood that he already knew. Somehow, in the space of walking through those revolving doors, he already knew that I knew, or at least suspected. Guilt has a very particular physics. It moves faster than words. "Let's sit down," he said. "Let me explain." I did not want to sit down. I wanted to scream at him in that lobby, in front of the bellhops and the woman at the front desk who had pressed her hand to her chest an hour earlier because she thought my life was so sweet. But I am an accountant. I have spent my entire career learning that the person who stays calm is the person who finds the truth, and the person who explodes is the person who gets managed, soothed, and handed a story instead of facts. So I sat down, and Richard told me a version of the truth that I would later prove, piece by piece, over the following 6 weeks, was not the whole truth at all. Just the smallest, safest slice of it he thought he could survive telling me. He said her name was Sandra. He said they'd met 8 years ago, at a bar near this same hotel, during one of his early Denver trips. He said it had gotten complicated, and that the boy, Elijah, 16, was his son. He said, and this is the part that still makes something in my chest go cold when I think about it, that he had never planned to tell me, because he had found a way to make it work without anyone getting hurt. Without anyone getting hurt. He said that sentence to me while I sat holding a bottle of unopened anniversary champagne, 6 hours in one time zone away from the home we'd built together, and he seemed to genuinely believe it was true. "How long?" I asked him, and my voice was very quiet, very steady. The voice I use when a client has brought me a shoebox of receipts and asked me to explain why they owe the IRS $11,000. How long has this been going on? 8 years, he said. But Diane, I love you. This doesn't change how I feel about you. I did not cry in that lobby. I want you to know that, because I think it surprised him more than tears would have. I stood up, I picked up my carry-on and my champagne, and I told him I was going to my own hotel room and that I would speak to him when I was ready, and not before. Diane, please, let's talk about this like adults. We are talking about this like adults, I told him. I'm the adult who is leaving the room instead of throwing this bottle at your head. Don't confuse my composure for forgiveness, Richard. I checked into a different hotel 4 blocks away, a small boutique place I found on my phone in the rideshare, and I sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed at 11 o'clock at night in a city I'd never planned to spend the night in. And I did the only thing that has ever made me feel like myself when the ground disappears beneath me. I opened my laptop, and I started making a list. The first thing I want you to understand about what happened over the following 6 weeks is that I did not confront Richard again with raised voices, and I did not confront Sandra at all. I have thought many times since about why I chose the path I chose, and I think the honest answer is this. I did not want an argument I could lose. I wanted the truth, in full, laid out where no one, not Richard, not a lawyer, not a judge, not even my own doubting heart at 3 a.m, could dispute it. So I built a file. I flew home the next morning, and I told Richard, when he texted me 9 times asking to talk, that I needed 2 weeks before I could be in the same room with him without saying something I couldn't take back. He agreed, mostly, I suspect, out of guilt and fear. And he stayed in a corporate apartment his company kept for consultants while I began, quietly, methodically, doing what I had done professionally for 20 years, following the money. I started with our joint accounts, which I already had full access to, and which, on the surface, looked unremarkable. But I know how to read a ledger the way some people read a face, and once I started looking closely, the pattern became impossible to unsee. There was a business account, technically Richard's, tied to a consulting LLC he'd told me years ago he'd set up for tax purposes on the advice of his accountant. Not me. A colleague of his I'd never met named a man called Harold Bester, who I would later learn did not exist under that name in any licensing database in the state of Colorado. Money moved from that account on a schedule that lined up, almost perfectly, with his Denver trips. Not huge amounts each time. $2,000 here, $3,800 there. Small enough to explain away as expenses, if anyone had ever thought to ask, which, for 8 years, no one had. I pulled our joint tax returns going back 9 years, and I found what I was looking for on the 3rd night, at 1 a.m, at my kitchen table, with a cup of coffee gone cold beside my laptop. A dependent deduction that shouldn't have existed, not on our returns. Richard was careful. I'll give him that much credit. He never touched our joint filings. But on a separate return, filed under the LLC, that a records request I made through my professional network turned up entirely by accident, because the registered agent address on that LLC was a UPS store 4 blocks from the Blackwood Grand Hotel. Elijah Bester. That was the name on the school enrollment records I eventually found. Records that are, I should say, not easy for a private citizen to access. And I want to be honest that I called in a favor from a colleague who owed me one, and I am not entirely proud of how I got that document, but I got it. Elijah Bester, born 8 years ago in Denver, Colorado, to a Sandra Bester, and a father listed on the birth certificate as Robert Bester. Robert Bester, not Richard Whitfield. I sat with that name for a long time. Robert Bester. My husband had built himself an entire second identity. Not a full legal name change. Nothing so clean as that, but a consistent alias, a Colorado driver's license under a name I would later confirm existed, obtained, I believe, through a document broker Richard had used years before we met. Back when he'd briefly worked adjacent to a logistics fraud investigation early in his career and had apparently learned far more from that case than any of his employers ever intended. Robert Bester had a Colorado address. Robert Bester had a bank account. Robert Bester, according to records I obtained through the same professional channels I used to verify vendor legitimacy for my clients, had been listed as Sandra's domestic partner on a Colorado state benefits form for the last 6 years. A form that, if Sandra had claimed him as a dependent partner for health coverage purposes while also representing herself as unmarried, which she had, constituted fraud. Not romantic betrayal. Fraud. Documented, provable, prosecutable fraud on top of the personal one. I want to pause here and tell you something important, because I think it's the part of this story people understand least. I did not go looking for a crime. I went looking for the truth about my marriage. But the truth about my marriage turned out to be a crime, layered on top of a betrayal, layered on top of a lie that had been running so long it had grown its own legal identity, its own tax history, its own 16 years. No, 8 years. Elijah's whole life of quiet, patient construction. Richard had not stumbled into an affair. Richard had built a second household with the same discipline he brought to a client audit. And on the 4th week of my 2 weeks of silence, doing research I had told no one about except Patricia, who by then had stopped asking when I'd be done with this and simply started bringing me dinner 3 nights a week so I would eat, I found the piece that broke something open in me that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with grief for a different reason entirely. I found Richard's father's obituary from 12 years ago while I was searching old public records for something else entirely, trying to trace how far back the document broker relationship went. And in that obituary, which I had read once before, at the funeral, in a fog of grief that hadn't left much room for careful reading, there was a line I'd never registered. Survived by his wife, Carol Whitfield, and children Richard and Denise, and also by Thomas of Ohio. Thomas of Ohio. I called Richard's older sister, Denise, who lives outside Raleigh and who I have always liked more than I think Richard realized, and I asked her, as gently as I could without explaining why I was asking, whether she knew anything about a half-brother named Thomas. There was a long silence on the phone. And then Denise, in a voice that had gone very quiet, told me a story I don't think she'd told anyone in years. That their father, Walter Whitfield, had kept a second family in Cincinnati for almost 11 years while married to their mother. That Richard had been 19 when it came out, home from college for the summer, and had been the one who answered the phone when the other woman called their house looking for Walter, thinking she'd reached his private line. Richard idolized our father, Denise told me. And then he found out our father was 2 men wearing one face. I think it broke something in him. He swore up and down he'd never do anything like that. He used to say it to me, actually. I will never put a woman through what Dad put Mom through. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment after we hung up, feeling something shift in my understanding of my husband that was not forgiveness. I want to be very clear about that. It was not forgiveness, but was something closer to a terrible, sad clarity. Richard had watched his father live a double life and had sworn to be different. And then, at some point in his 40s, tired or lonely or simply weak in a moment he never told me about, he had become his father exactly. Not despite the vow. Almost, it seemed to me, because of the specific shape of the shame that vow had been built on. He hadn't planned to become Walter Whitfield, but when the opportunity came, he had known exactly, precisely, from decades of watching, how to build the architecture to hide it. He'd had a blueprint. He just never told me he was using it. This didn't make me angry at Richard's father, who was long dead and past accounting for his own choices. It made me angry at Richard in a new and different way. Not for the affair itself, which was its own devastating thing, but for the specific, deliberate craftsmanship of the concealment. He had not fallen into this. He had engineered it, using a lifetime of first-hand knowledge about exactly how a man hides a second family from the woman who trusts him. I thought about Elijah's face in that hotel doorway. The same eyes. The same jaw. I thought about how, in another 8 years, if nothing changed, that boy might be 19 years old, home from college, answering a phone call from a woman he didn't know, learning the exact same lesson his father had learned at the exact same age, in the exact same way. The cycle does not break itself. Someone has to be the one who stops carrying it forward. I decided, sitting at my kitchen table with Denise's voice still echoing in my ears, that it was not going to be me who let it continue by staying quiet. I called Richard on a Tuesday and told him I was ready to talk, and I asked him to come to the house, not to a restaurant, not to a lawyer's office, but to our kitchen table, the same one where I'd built the file that now sat, printed and organized in a black binder, on the seat beside me. He came in looking hopeful, which told me he had badly misjudged what this conversation was going to be. He must have believed that 2 weeks of silence followed by an invitation home meant I was ready to find a way through this. I let him sit down across from me before I opened the binder. I did not raise my voice once. I want to tell you that clearly, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. I laid out, page by page, exactly what I had found. The LLC. The pattern of withdrawals across 8 years. Robert Bester's Colorado driver's license, a copy of which I had obtained through channels I will not detail here, but which I assure you were legal, if creatively persistent. Elijah's birth certificate. The domestic partner benefits fraud. And finally, the connection to his father. Not as an accusation, but as a fact I laid on the table between us, quiet and terrible, because I needed him to hear it in his own history, and not just mine. I watched Richard's face go through something I can only describe as the collapse of a very long performance. He didn't argue with a single document. He knew, looking at that binder, that arguing would be pointless, because I had not brought him feelings. I had brought him facts, and facts, unlike feelings, do not bend under pressure. I was going to tell you, he said finally, which was, I think, the only sentence he offered that whole evening that I genuinely believe was a lie, even in his own mind as he said it. You had 8 years to tell me, Richard, I said. You had 8 anniversaries to tell me. You had 2 children who deserved to know they had a brother. You had a wife who deserves better than finding out from a teenage boy holding a video game controller. I told him, that night, that I was filing for divorce, and that I had already retained an attorney. A sharp, unflappable woman named Carla Ibhawo, who specialized in complex asset division and who had looked through my binder 2 days earlier with an expression I can only describe as professional delight, the look of a lawyer who has just been handed a case she cannot lose. I also told him something else. That I intended to report the fraudulent use of a second legal identity to the appropriate state authorities. Not out of vengeance, but because a man cannot simply build himself a false driver's license and a shadow LLC and walk away from that the moment his marriage ends. That Sandra's benefits fraud was a separate matter I would leave in the hands of the relevant agency, because it was not, strictly, mine to forgive or pursue. But it was mine to report, and I would. Richard asked me, quietly, near the end of that conversation, if there was anything he could do to fix this. No, I told him, but there's something you can do to be a better father than yours was, starting now. Tell Marcus and Renee the truth yourself, before they hear it from a court filing. Tell Elijah the truth about who you actually are, and stop making Sandra carry a lie that was never fully hers to carry alone. Those are the only 2 things left that are still in your power to do well. He left the house that night looking like a man who had aged 5 years and 5 weeks. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that too. I felt, mostly, like someone standing in the wreckage of a building I had genuinely believed was load-bearing, doing the only thing that made sense in that moment, which was to start, calmly, cataloging what could still be salvaged. The divorce took 14 months. Carla was, as promised, formidable. The discovery of the LLC and the pattern of diverted funds meant Richard's attorney had almost nothing to negotiate with, and the settlement reflected that. I kept the house. I kept my practice, which had never been touched by any of it. I received a settlement that accounted, with painstaking precision, for 8 years of marital funds that had been quietly redirected toward a second household without my knowledge or consent. Richard did report the identity fraud voluntarily, in the end, on the advice of his own attorney, who apparently understood that a client who came forward looked considerably better to a judge than a client who was caught. It resulted in a fine and a period of probation, not prison, and I want to say plainly that I never wanted him in prison. I wanted the truth on the record. I wanted the false name retired. I wanted, more than anything, for the paperwork of his life to finally match the reality of it. Elijah is 18 now. I have never met him again since that night in the hotel doorway, and I don't know that I ever will, and I have made peace with that. He is not responsible for anything that happened, and I hold no anger toward him at all. Only, if I'm honest, a strange, complicated tenderness for a boy who has his father's face, and, I hope, a very different future than the one that Face's history might have predicted for him. Marcus and Renee took the news the way adult children take news like this, with a mixture of fury, grief, and a strange, protective loyalty toward me that surprised me with how fiercely it arrived. Renee didn't speak to her father for almost 8 months. Marcus spoke to him more, cautiously, mostly, I think, because he wanted to understand rather than to forgive. Both of them, in their own way, have told me some version of the same thing, that watching how I handled it, calmly, thoroughly, without ever losing myself in the process, changed how they think about strength. "You didn't scream, Mom," Renee told me once, months later, sitting at that same kitchen table where I'd laid out the binder. "You just got quiet and got proof. I don't think I understood until I watched you do it that those are the same thing." I sold the champagne bottle a strange kind of symbolic significance in my head for a while. I kept it, unopened, in the back of a cabinet for almost a year, not sure why I couldn't throw it away. Eventually, on the night my divorce was finalized, I opened it alone in my kitchen and drank a single glass, not in celebration of the marriage ending, but in recognition of something else. The 28-year-old woman who had once waited nervously for a man to bring her coffee exactly right, and the 53-year-old woman who now knew that paying attention, real attention, the kind Richard, had once claimed for himself and then betrayed so thoroughly, was something I had actually possessed all along. I had simply never had to use it against the person I loved most until I did. I still run my practice. It's grown, actually. In a strange twist I didn't see coming, 2 other women going through similar situations found their way to me over the following 2 years, referred quietly by Carla, needing someone who understood both the numbers and the specific, particular grief of discovering that a marriage had a second set of books. I never advertised for that work. It found me, the way certain kinds of pain always seem to find the people who've already survived it. I flew to Denver once more, almost 2 years after that first trip, for an entirely unrelated reason. A conference for financial professionals specializing in asset discovery, an ironic and not entirely unwelcome twist of fate. I stayed at a different hotel. I did not think about room 914 nearly as much as I expected to. I sat in the hotel bar on the last night of the conference, ordered a glass of wine, and toasted, quietly, alone, to the version of myself who had once stood frozen in a hallway, holding an unopened bottle of champagne, and who had somehow, without any template for how to do it, figured out exactly what to do next. People ask me sometimes, when they hear this story, what I would tell a woman standing exactly where I once stood, in a hallway, holding something meant for celebration, staring at a door that has just opened onto a truth she never asked for. I tell them this: don't scream in the hallway, not because your anger isn't justified. It is completely. But because the version of you that stays calm long enough to gather the truth is the version of you that walks away with your dignity, your resources, and your children's respect fully intact. Grief will still come. It came for me, in waves, at strange times. Driving past a restaurant we used to go to, hearing a song from our wedding, watching Marcus's face do something that reminded me, for one unbearable second, of his father's. But grief and dignity are not opposites. You can hold both at once. I also tell them this: the truth, however devastating, is never actually the enemy. The lie was the enemy. The truth, once I had all of it, was simply the exit door I'd been circling for 8 years without knowing it was there. I turned 54 this spring. I did not fly anywhere to surprise anyone. I spent the day with Renee and Marcus, both of whom flew in on their own, without telling me, and knocked on my door the way I once knocked on a hotel room 9 floors above a city I never wanted to see again. When I opened that door and saw both of their faces standing there, I did not freeze. I laughed, and I pulled them both inside. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, the surprise on the other side of a door was exactly, simply, what it appeared to be. That, I've come to understand, is its own kind of anniversary. Not the day a marriage began, but the day you finally trust a door again. If this story moved you, you're not alone. Thousands of women in this community have lived some version of Diane's silence and her patience. If you believe the truth is always worth the wait, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week's story might be the one that feels like it was written about you. And if you're going through something like this right now, you don't have to scream to be heard. Sometimes the quietest woman in the room is the one who ends up holding all the proof.